Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by returning guest Angelica Oung, coming to us from Taiwan. Angelica has recently joined the Decouple team and will very shortly be releasing our new Decouple Substack. We haven't fully come up with the name yet. It may be Dispatches.
We're going with Decouple Dispatch. I think Decouple Dispatches or Decouple Dispatch. Either way, I think it sounds good.
Absolutely, absolutely. So looking forward to that new product offering and Angelica as a correspondent. But today, we both read a book, which I think for obvious reasons was enticing to us. And we're going to discuss that book today. Angelica, what's the book?
The name of the book is How to Get Big Things Done, and it's by Professor Bent Flyvbjerg, I believe. Um, Sorry if I got the pronunciation right. He's Danish.
F Flyvbjerg. I mean, I as my dedicated listeners know, I think Finnish names are the ones I struggle with the most. But the Danes are kind of related, I guess. Hopefully, I haven't offended anyone. Yeah. So this book certainly has been making the rounds. The marketing's been pretty good for it. And hearing that you just read the book, I thought let's get into this. And don't want to steal any thunder from Bram Neufeld's Decouple Reads. That's our Decouple book club. This may end up being one. But anyway, felt urgent, felt like we should get to it. So Angelica, why don't we start off with some kind of, well, I was going to say gut reactions, but maybe kind of a broad overview is in place. I'll let you decide.
hmm Well, when I first read the book, I was so excited about it when I first heard about the book because this is exactly the kind of topic I think needs to be discussed, and especially since we're so interested in nuclear. And the book started off really well. I'm just gonna give you my rundown. As I read it, I thought that he was going into some good examples. Was very readable in the kind of Malcolm Gladwell kind of vein. But then I realized that his conclusions are just seems really shoehorned in there because he gives you all the projects, the big projects, right? The whole thing about this book is how do we build big things? Why do some big projects succeed and some fail? Most fail spectacularly. That was a very good point. One of the example he gives is contrasting the Sydney Opera House, which I didn't know this. It was a mega project that went way over budget, and it was a destroy the career of the architect that built it. Um, why was that a failure, and why was a Guggenheim just as crazy a building um, by Frank Gehry? Why was that such a success? And even though it looks utterly crazy, both buildings are absolute masterpieces. Why was one a success in terms of construction and the other a failure? So that I thought that example was really interesting. I learned a lot. But fast forward, the conclusion of his book is basically you have to build things in this modular way. That's basically like one brick at a time, and that's why solar is good and nuclear is bad. And I'm not just not seeing the through line between the how he started the book and his conclusion.
Yeah, yeah. I'd agree. I mean, it's obviously a pretty technical topic that should be of broad interest, not just to policymakers and project managers and the like. And they do make it relevant, I think, to more of the lay public discussing what is the biggest infrastructure project of many people's lives if you're lucky enough to be a homeowner, home renovation. He also talks about Pixar as a studio. I
Yeah.
guess
hmm
identifying these outliers like Frank Gehry, right, who delivers these
Yes.
fantastical buildings, bizarre shapes. I mean, just Google the picture of the Guggenheim. I mean, I hadn't appreciated what a crazy building that was. Um, but I think looking at the outliers of who's done it well, Pixar, like basically every one of their productions has been a smash hit, and there is a reason behind that. And of course, I'm drawn to it because I talk ad nauseum about the nuclear secret sauce. I'm fascinated by this technology, which it requires incredible excellence, human organization, collaboration between industry, government, regulator, etc. When it's done amazingly, it's a beautiful value proposition and delivers for generations. And so I was hoping to gain some insights in my quest to further understand the nuclear secret sauce. And I have to say I was a bit let down. the book is based upon the Flyvbjerg database, in which he's apparently gathered information and stats on 16,000 mega projects. And the results are pretty shocking. I mean, the majority go over budget, the majority go over time. And when he combines together over budget, over schedule, and the value, did it actually deliver on the value? Something like less than 1% actually fulfill that criteria. And in terms of delivering on the value, maybe I should just give an example, but the California high-speed rail experiment, I think, is supposed to link up San Francisco and LA. In the end, it's been such a boondoggle and fiasco. They're basically building a railroad to nowhere, doing the first, 100-kilometer leg, and it's going to be functionally useless. So those criteria I thought were very important, because even though the Sydney Opera House, which went something like 500% over budget, was just this huge boondoggle, ultimately, has delivered an enduring value to the city. It's an icon. The tourist boom has probably been huge over many decades. It will probably pay itself off in terms of those cost overruns. And I think that's, it's a point I made on Twitter comparing, calling Vogel the Sydney Opera House of nuclear. Vogel, while, being, a boondoggle financially and by schedule over its 80 years, it's going to be a blip. So, those were what drew me into the book and maybe what turned me off a little bit about it. It did seem a little surface level, again, I think because it's meant to be a pop culture book. It was quite short. Like, I couldn't believe I was done it when I was kind of left thirsting for more. But
I have to say, I actually do recommend that people read this book if they're interested in projects, because I think there's going to be some of the examples that you don't know. I think it's ultimately flawed in its discussion of some of these projects, especially the nuclear ones, because Flyvbjerg seems to just take it as a given that because nuclear power, should we talk a little bit about his formulation of fat tails versus thin tails?
Yeah, and normal distribution bias.
Yep.
Yeah, let's do that.
So basically, we assume that things tend to fall into a normal distribution. And for instance, the height of human beings, and you have people who are taller than others, but basically they fall on a normal distribution. And we've got tall nuclear right here, but Chris is taller than most people, but he's not like
I am
10 times.
I'm 3 standard deviations off. Yeah.
3 standard deviations, and you're not like 3 times taller, right? But if you take somebody who's like 3 standard deviation away in terms of wealth or something, then all of a sudden you can get somebody who's like much, much wealthier than the average person, and he calls that the fat tail. And when it comes to all these mega projects that blow out their budget, there's a fat tail, meaning if they go way over budget, then they don't go over by like a little. They go over. They have the potential to like almost just limitless downside. And in terms of fat tail project, it's true if you look at his chart. Although we can't see in his model, like it's proprietary apparently, but nuclear power is up there, but it's flanked by both sides, by IT on one side and the Olympics on the other side. So I really don't understand why Flyvbjerg's conclusion is basically that nuclear power is just hopeless, whereas he's not. I don't see how we can avoid building. There's some things that we just need. We need IT, we need the Olympics. We need to figure out how to do those big projects.
Exactly. How to do them well. What's the secret sauce for sure? And I think he, and especially in his post promoting the book, basically says that, nuclear just is not doable. And he's not looking, not just at the exceptions to the rule, but I mean, this is again something that fascinates me, that in country over country, nuclear has been done well for maybe a decade or two. Starting in the US in the 60s, amazing economic quick builds. Pickering, our first large CANDU station here, 8 reactors, under budget, under time. France, did quite well. Japan, South Korea, I don't want to name them all, but there's a track record of success, which again, the database is proprietary, but I do feel like it's being skewed by recent builds, such as the EPRs in Europe, and Vogel. Um, there's another point in his book, and I don't want to jump ahead too much, but he talks about the need to think right to left. So to really establish what are your goals, and I think the example is the Danes, his homeland, wanting to connect an island to the mainland, and assuming it should be a tunnel, for instance. And just to have that thought in the early stage, to take a long time planning and to act quickly, plan slow, act fast, but maybe it's better served by, a bridge, maybe best served by an airport, maybe best served just by a Zoom link. That we need to think of these things. And I think that was, his kind of conclusion on the energy front is that because wind and solar have a very, like basically no tendency towards fat tails, really, the best modern construction project in terms of being built on budget and on time are wind and solar. And I guess we'll talk about some of the reasons behind that. But that's what we should do. And I think that's a real failure on his part to consider the goal. And if the goal is deep decarbonization, if the goal is ultra reliable electricity to electrify everything, if the goal is a just transition, et cetera, we need to look at what that is. And my example in my tweet dissecting the book was, it's very easy to make bicycles. We can bang those things out in a factory. We can put them on a production line, mass produce them. But if our goal is to move freight, it might be better to build a locomotive and a railroad. Ultimately, it's going to be a more complicated construction project. It's going to take longer, but the payoff's going to be bigger. And I think it is a decent comparison between wind and solar and nuclear. Bicyclists have to take breaks. If the weather's really bad, they might not be able to ride if it's pitch black outside, if they need to stop to eat 3 times a day. It's one I've used before, but I think it's apt. And I think that's ultimately where the book kind of falls flat in its conclusions, because I agree there's a lot of value in some of the other projects he discusses, and not being a huge architecture buff, I mean, I still have an appreciation for it. But this idea that the construction is the only element rather than the end goal, despite him saying otherwise, I guess I'd leave the rant there.
I would just like to add that the complexity goes somewhere. So let's say, yeah, it is easier to construct a solar panel array than a nuclear power plant, but because they don't produce energy on a steady baseload basis, now you are faced with figuring out how to add enough grid balancing storage in order to deliver a steady stream of electricity. So you think you're reducing the complexity of your construction projects, but no, because you need the grid to deliver all the time, you're actually adding complexity, and worse than adding complexity, you're adding unknowns, because his other big heuristic is that we should do what he calls right to left thinking, what you were talking about earlier, which is you start with what is your goal? Always go back to what is your goal. Don't get suckered into starting something just to start something. Think about your ultimate goal, then you can be creative and outside the box in how you accomplish that goal, right? But if you're doing this thing where you're just like building a bunch of wind and solar, and your goal is not actually make a bunch of electricity, but deliver a steady stream of electricity, now you're not doing right to left thinking. In fact, you're just committing to this mega project that you don't even know what would work. I don't think anybody knows that 100% variable electricity grid would work. It's progress, but we don't know where it's going to take us.
For sure. And I think that leads him to, and it's understandable he has this bias of like, well, what can we construct? Well, let's do that. But I think that is a kind of fatal flaw. So, I mean, for him, the challenge I would pose to him is just do the mental exercise to say that nuclear is necessary. Let's study that and figure out how that big thing can get done. And I guess on that theme, why don't we shift over a little bit to discussing, I think, probably the most memorable part of the book, which is this comparison to the Sydney Opera House and the Guggenheim Museum and how they were different. And the Frank Gehry approach. Frank Gehry is the architect and firm, which again has consistently delivered on budget and on time these fantastical buildings all over the world. Why don't you describe a little bit that Frank Gehry process, and we can see whether there's been nuclear builds that are doing something similar, or what the nuclear industry maybe could learn from it.
Yeah, maybe we might be mentioning them by the onesies and twosies, but Chris, should we go through what all of his heuristics are, and then maybe we can apply them to a nuclear project? So it starts off with understanding your odds. If you don't know what your odds are, you won't win. His next heuristic, plan slow, act fast. I thought this was quite a good point, which is that uh, planning is essentially costless, and but once you start executing, then you get into potentially expensive trouble. A really good example of this is, say, if you have a film production that's um, in the planning stage as the COVID pandemic struck. You're fine. Your project is in hibernation. You wait it out, and then you pick it up again. But if you started shooting and the COVID pandemic struck, all of a sudden it's an expensive disaster. You've got all these actors, you've got all these staff. Um, so that's basically, he's like biased towards doing a ton of planning. We talked about thinking right to left, and that just means starting with your goal. And then you identify the steps that you need to get there. The next one is, which we also talked about a little bit, um, he calls find your Lego. And that means that he believes that big is best built from small. And I do believe that if you can do it and still achieve your goal, then you're sure that makes a lot of sense. Um, this thinking, I think, is quite pervasive. You find the smallest unit, and then you make it repeatable, and you have your learning, and you do it faster and faster. Um, be a team maker. You want to succeed without an us. I think that's pretty well known everywhere. And master the unknown unknowns. So that is basically like there's no substitute for experience, and I think um, we call it like implicit tacit knowledge. It's just like you can learn things. You can learn like explicit pieces of knowledge, passing it on in textbooks, in training. But then there are things that are more intuitive that only come through experience. We've seen that a lot in nuclear power plants, and he uses this word I like a lot, which is called phronesis, and that concept is basically kind of practical wisdom that has to be learned through experience. And so he's basically like, these are the heuristic for determining how mega projects can beat the odds and be successful. So maybe from we can apply those to a nuclear project.
Yeah, or maybe again, I keep going back to the Guggenheim, but I think Frank Gehry's, he's
Yeah.
referenced in the book number of times, and I mean, just a few things that stood out for me. Obviously, he's got a very well established team about him, and his team goes with him to each project in terms of the key
Yes.
engineers, structural people. In terms of their methodology, again, these bizarrely shaped buildings with lots of curves. They actually got the software from the airline industry, where fuselages have a lot of structural issues not being boxes and squares that they're solved with this technology. And I mean, I think that's also why the Olympics tend to go over, is because it's an economic development project. You contract local people to do it, but this is an event that you've probably never done before in your city, or maybe the last time was a generation ago. That sounds pretty reminiscent of a lot of new nuclear builds in the West. Um,
Yeah,
you know, one
absolutely.
can one can imagine that the Olympic Committee might, have this dream team of people that would go city to city, but that just doesn't make enough sense. Frank Gehry's able to do that and pull off these buildings. The think right to left. I think when he went to the Basque Country, Bilbao, they wanted him to renovate a warehouse, and he kind of did some thinking and identified more of what their goals were. That this was really to be an iconic building to kickstart their tourism industry, and so proposed the site, and was really good at that. The planning, they do, I think, a ton of iterative planning, lots of drawings using this software to model it out, make sure they figured out all the structural issues. And the comparison with the Sydney Opera House was fascinating, right? Because it sounded
Yeah.
like the design process there was like essentially a back of the envelope sketch of these beautiful wing shapes. And this architect had never built anything before in his life. And then they had to sort of move backwards from there and figure out how to construct those shapes. And in the end, they learned that acoustically, the place is a nightmare for opera. So the
That's
contrast
hilarious.
the
Oh,
contrast
yeah.
was very cool there. But I'm not sure if there's any other, tidbits from Frank Gehry, or if you want to move on to sort of,
Well, I
how to apply those to nuclear.
actually think that it's a great way to talk about how we apply to nuclear, because I think in many ways, Frank Gehry's building, um, it's highly complex structure, and it is like a nuclear power plant. And I think your comparison of the Sydney Opera House with Voltal, and Frank Gehry's building with Baraka, which is the um, nuclear power plants that the Koreans recently built in 10 years in a country that didn't have nuclear before. It the parallels are right there. And we know from the Barakas of the world and from the French nuclear build out that it's not impossible to build nuclear on time and on budget, and to deliver way more benefits than we thought we were going to get, since it turns out nuclear power plants are practically immortal and you can just keep extending their lifetimes, you know, from 40 years, which we expected, up to 60, 80 years now. So all those things are possible, and it's a matter of actually applying Professor Flubert's the tools that he came up in his own book, to nuclear power plants. And I think if had he truly appreciated the value that nuclear power plants actually bring to our energy systems, maybe he wouldn't have been so dismissive and just assumed that, well, maybe we shouldn't build them because they're not Legos.
Because they're high risk. I imagine building like one of a kind fantastical museums is also high risk, right? I mean, it's got to be, in terms of the kind of shapes, sizes, bizarre stuff that they're doing. That's not utilitarian, but again, it has an aesthetic purpose. It draws the crowds. There's a value proposition to it. I think the analogy is really strong, and so. He did reply to my Twitter thread. He said, "Read the book. You don't understand." I had read the book. I talked to his co-author for an hour. Anyway, I do think that his anti-nuclear priors are probably getting in the way of a very interesting exploration, very analogous, as you said, to the Sydney Opera House and the Guggenheim. On the find your Lego element, you had a great summary actually of my interview with Tony Rollstone. It was on SMRs and economics. And of course, we want to modularize and do in a factory as much as we can. And, his suggestion was, currently maybe we're at 20% modularization. And if we can bump that up to 50 or 60, that's going to be very beneficial. I think that something that frustrates me with nuclear in the West is, and something that's a valuable contribution from the book, is just this understanding of how goddamn hard it is, right? That 95, 99% of mega projects don't deliver on budget, on time, or the value proposition. And so I think if the nuclear industry in the West starts with that, and with this utter humility and utmost respect from the Frank Gehrys, the Koreans with their APR 1400s, maybe where the Chinese are at now with their Halong 1, or the Russians with the VVR, if we start with, let's figure out what works. Let's be humble that, frankly, we've proven ourselves not to be good at this, or we have a lot of catch up to do. Then we have a greater chance.
Maybe our Lego is the gigawatt scale nuclear power plant. Because if you think about it, sure, there's a lot of on-site work. Sure, it's not made in a factory. But if you look at how the French did it, something that's almost the same as Legos, I've heard it described as a cookie cutter approach. You don't change anything about your plant. You don't get tempted into design upgrades, or you don't fuss about to increase efficiency by 10%. You just do it the same way because that's the way you know how to do it. You get a lot of efficiency and savings and learnings from that. And I forgot, like, they built 50 something nuclear power plants in a span of 2 decades or something like that, and they're still working to this day. So maybe the lesson should be go big or go home. If you do a France, you have more of a chance of succeeding than if you just build them in the onesies and the twosies. I don't know.
I think maybe it could be sort of a Lego versus Duplo. Duplo, for the non-parents out there, just really much bigger blocks. But like if there's enough of a societal impetus and a need to build a lot of, say, electricity generation, I think the French, there was a factory that was pounding out in Shoes, I believe, or Chaluz, 8 reactor pressure vessels every single year. So they'd scaled things up to the
Wow.
extent that that was modular. Obviously, if you're just building one EPR every 20 years, the scaling isn't there because you haven't mobilized your entire industrial base around a sufficient number of projects for there to be learning and replication, and building multiple units on the same site, for instance. And in that way, like what we've been seeing in the West, is really stagnating demand for electricity. So it makes sense that there just simply hasn't been the financing there to build, to continue, say, the legacy in Ontario of building 8-unit nuclear plants, because investors want to know, is there going to be someone to buy this electricity and pay off your debt to us? And there hasn't been. Maybe with the climate imperative and electrification, we're going to see that again. And that will allow us to go big, as you're saying, but also, be able to learn, do things in sequence, et cetera. But it's challenging. I wanted to talk to you a little bit because obviously you have a big background in offshore wind. Um,
Yeah.
and something that they talk about is that, wind and solar, why are they so easy to construct? So why don't you give us your reflections on that? I'm not sure. I think you were getting your certification to go out to like physically be on these offshore wind platforms. Have you?
I haven't gotten an opportunity to do that yet. But basically, I don't know if I'm the best person to ask on this because Taiwan's offshore wind development is actually running into some issues with a lot of the cost overruns and lack of left to right thinking. And I think a very important point that he makes well is how localization can really hurt you. So basically, the Taiwanese government made the strategic um, blunder, in my opinion, of asking that a bunch of the offshore wind components be made in Taiwan. These are huge, like absolutely enormous jackets, tower pieces, blades, nacelles. So we are now building the most expensive offshore wind farms in the world now in Taiwan, and a number of them are way, way behind budget, and it's definitely not the kind of nice, clean, cost down curve that you see in some of the other, I think especially the solar projects have cost down really, really convincingly. But in my opinion, I don't see wind as continuing that cost down trajectory. I think at some point, especially with commodity prices and inflation like this, we've seen in the news all these turbine manufacturers like Vestas and Siemens Gamesa. They're not making money. They're losing, in fact, huge amount of money. The vessel owners are bleeding. Developers aren't making much. So uh, like I said, I could only talk about my own personal professional experience. But I think at some point, we're not going to keep costing down forever. But interestingly, people accept that. People accept that, okay, we will have to, let's say we've exploited all the easy sites and we need to push out into the ocean, into the water so deep that we have to have a floating foundation. All these Eiffel Tower sized wind turbines have to float now. Um,
Wow.
yeah, and so it's definitely going to be more expensive. There will be a cost down journey, but it will probably never be as cheap as bottom fixed offshore wind turbines, just because floating is going to be more expensive.
Yeah.
So we accept that because I think floating wind, the value proposition is it is a little bit more stable. The winds are a little bit stronger. With larger turbines also come strength. Um, I don't know, and stability. You get to tap into the air currents that are a little bit higher up. But there's a awareness of trade off, and that's what I ask for nuclear. Is like people are you know acknowledge that it's the stability is good.
No, I mean, I think that's interesting to approach the Taiwanese experience anyway. And I mean, I think it's starting to be replicated. Gamesa, Siemens apparently have no
That's a
orders in the
global
fourth quarter.
problem. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But in terms of Taiwan, and we had a great episode with you on Taiwan, where you were sketching out some of the energy dynamics there, and this kind of virtual blockade of Taiwan that could occur simply from China buying up all the available liquefied natural gas cargoes, particularly as Taiwan heads in to shutting down its nuclear plants.
Not so
And
much buying up because we do have long-term contracts that are 25
right.
years. What I noticed was during Nancy Pelosi's visit, they were just like, well, missiles might fall out of the sky here, 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 and it totally disrupted commercial traffic. It's like a
Oh,
ghost
interesting.
blockade.
Right. Cool. Cool. Well, let's not get too sidetracked on the Taiwan side of things. Um, but yeah, let's dive back into the book. What else did you find interesting in terms of we've been heavy on the critiques here. Some other positives or things that you took from it that you enjoyed.
Um, I think the thing that I one of the most valuable things and so true to my experience is a misalignment of incentives between the people um, trying to push the project through and the actual interest of the greater unit, be it the country or the company or whatever. There's a misalignment of incentives. And I think Fluberg describes so well that for the people who are trying to get the project started, sometimes you just want to spend enough money that the real decision makers can't take it away from you because
Right.
it would be too embarrassing, right? And I don't think he used this example in the book actually, but it jumped out at me. It reminded me of I think the Wachowski now sisters when they shot The Matrix, they blew their initial budget on that cool initial scene with the bullets frozen in space and people fighting around the frozen bullet. And that's it. They spent the whole budget for the movie on that, and then they went back to the studio and say, "Well, this is what we did. Are you going to give us more money?" And at that
Right.
point, and I think that happens a lot. And why do politicians overpromise? It's because they want to secure their political legacy. Why do executives overpromise? Because they know that if that project gets started, um, then good things will come to them. And a lot of the times that's how it works out. Or, if you're too responsible, those big projects don't get done. And so you have these um, probably way too over arrogant people, and they just do whatever it takes to get it through.
Well, I guess going back a little bit to the plan slow, act fast component, I had a really fascinating tour recently in Ontario. We're doing these can-do refurbishments, which buy us another 30 to 40 years of life out of our can-do units, which will go into their 70s and 80s. So really exciting, but it is complex work. For those who have been following me on Twitter, you're probably seeing a few diagrams posted of can-dos. The truly modular core reactor, with 480 pressure tubes, each of those needs to be changed out. There's a pipe fitting on either side. So what 900 and my math is that bad right now. I'm tired. 960 tubes coming in. It's a lot of work, really complex. The tolerances are down to thousandths of an inch, and obviously has the potential to be disastrous. I'm sure Bent would look at that and go, "Oh my God." But something I think he'd really appreciate, and this is what I got to visit, was this mock-up. They spent something like $60 million building this big warehouse and a life-sized CANDU reactor, calandria, with the pressure tubes in place, with a bunch of manufacturing right there on site to do tooling and everything laid out perfectly. They'd use lasers to capture the exact dimensions, and for workers to practice before they go into the reactor vault, where there might be some limitations in terms of dosing to get in and out quickly. And the payback had just been absolutely enormous. But it was really neat to see this in real life. A lot of nuclear reactors are a bit of a mystery to folks that are not nuclear engineers, just seeing all the containment around them. But having that stripped away and being able to look into this pretty small physical space, like the calandria vessel where all the pressure tubes go through. I'm trying to find a good comparator for it. I mean, it's certainly smaller than, I don't know, the second floor of my house here, and it's providing 5% of the power of the entire province. Like you saw the power density. I'm going
Wow.
off on track here a little bit, but that whole, again, planning, and we are going to have Gary Rose, who's head of new nuclear at OPG, and really was a lot of the brains behind making these refurbishments go so well. He's going to be on the podcast soon to discuss that. But a neat illustration, and I'd love to bring Bent or or Dan Gardner, his co-writer, to come and check out that facility because I think it really speaks to what they're talking about and is the reason why our refurbishments are coming in under budget and ahead of schedule. They found a process just in terms of the tacit knowledge as well. You can gain that tacit knowledge even in a rehearsal space like this, but they figured out they could take out two things at once essentially during this refurb, and they cut a month off their schedule, which is just enormous. So those examples are out there. They're happening in the nuclear industry, and it's kind of what makes me really bullish about nuclear in Canada is that we have a lot of the ingredients, and we have really an experienced industry that is pulling off mega projects really well right now. So I'm going to stop tooting my Ontarian horn here, but
Well, I think it just goes to show that Bent isn't wrong in his heuristics, and he's chosen good examples to illustrate them, and they fit pretty well to the nuclear industry, both in terms of its failures and its success. I just think that he's perhaps a little bit just too fixed um, in his belief that somehow wind and solar and nuclear are interchangeable things, and that if you can build uh, wind and nuclear so easily, you can give up on nuclear. Sorry, wind and solar so easily, you can give up on nuclear. And I just don't think that's a true assumption. But I'm tremendously excited by this kind of thinking being out there. Thinking about how this is meta learning, learning about how to learn, build. Learning about how to build in a very like he would say outsider thinking, trying to take yourself outside of your assumptions and addressing your projects. And I would like to actually talk about some of his fellow Danes. So I went to visit Copenhagen Atomics in Copenhagen, duh. And they do molten salt reactors. And Denmark is actually doesn't allow. There's actually a law against nuclear power. So how do they manage to build a startup involving small modular molten salt reactors? And actually, they just do as much as they can without the radioactivity. They build it, they test the salt, they control for the corrosion, they make sure all those systems are working. They have a lot of engineering work done, and then they use a lot of digital twins work. So that's kind of reminiscent of, you know, the Pixar or the Frank Gehry example, where it's like using as much mock-ups as possible. And they hope that in this way, they can still do the iteration and the fast design and the kind of constant testing of your concept in an engineering fashion, but without the radioactivity. Of course, that approach will only get them so far. At some point, you need to introduce the radioactivity. But I think that's something that's a very refreshing line of thinking, and I hope that it'll yield fruit in the future.
so they have a physical warehouse and they have mock-ups, made out of
Yeah,
real world
yeah.
materials, and
Well,
then
he- here's the
go
thing
ahead. Yeah.
with molten salt. A huge part of the challenge is actually controlling for the fact that it's extremely corrosive. So figuring out how to do that part, they can do without the radioactivity.
Right.
Of
Right.
course, that's going to make it worse, but then they have digital twins and stuff like that. And yeah, they hopefully they've established a branch in the UK where they will be once they get through the licensing process, they will be able to one day work with actual radioactivity. Yeah.
Right. Right. That's really exciting. Cool. Well, I think we can make it a shorter one today, unless there's any other kind of key points that you wanted to explore at all.
No, no, I would just say that I still think the book is, very worth reading. And I think we as nuclear advocates can feel good that even though it's more challenging than a lot of other things, there are in fact tremendous space for improvement in nuclear projects um, if we can apply a lot of these principles that are in the book.
What's your score out of 10 here? Let's
Well, I think this book is pretty good. I'm gonna give it a solid 8 out of 10.
All right, all right.
And you?
I'm lower. I'm kind of like maybe a 6.5. And
I think
I got
you know what?
you could
I think you're
probably
mad. I think you're mad at
totally,
how
totally. I was
badly
gonna
he
say.
railroaded Chris. I don't think Chris. I don't think you can make a judgment that separates the fact that
I
he did railroad nuclear in the
I
book
I
from
was
the
gonna
fact that you
I was
know.
gonna provide a qualifier that there's probably a -2 just associated with that. But no, I mean, in real terms, I do try and check that bias and that frustration. I did feel like it was a little too shallow, a little too pop culture. It's quite a
Uh-huh.
short book, a little
Yes.
gimmicky. But the strongest parts were definitely some of the narratives around the different kind of projects. And we didn't really talk about the Pixar as much in detail, but just having watched a few shows recently and your jaw just drops. Like, how did they not see this inconsistency? Or maybe they didn't care about it. I'm a nitpicker, right? Especially when I see anything medical that's they've completely botched. But in sort of hearing that Pixar process of really, starting with an idea, like a grumpy old man, and then fleshing that out into a story and creating a sort of a storyboard and getting tons of peer review, that was a really kind of compelling process. So, I think looking beyond just nuclear and being like the nerd that I am, I can see some real value in the book. Maybe I'll bump it up to a 7. But
Well, good. I Yeah, definitely. Read it. And I think the disagreement is actually good. I think we need to get fired up about uh, our process here. And yeah, that's all for the book. I just like to add that I am going to be starting the Substack with a pipeline of different articles. So if you have some subjects that you'd like to me to report on, just let me know. Write to me at on the Decouple DM are open, and I'm off to investigate.
awesome, awesome. Okay, folks, thanks for tuning in, and we'll be back with some more content next week.